Mr. David Kramer, President of Freedom House, the former Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy and Human Rights.
To invite here our next speaker, David Kramer, President of Freedom House, and in the past Mr. Kramer was the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. With Mr. Kramer we will elaborate on the subject of corruption. Corruption is seen as a major threat to freedoms in Ukraine, and Mr. Kramer will update us and will share his insights on this subject with us. Without any further ado, Mr. Kramer.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. This is my first visit since April when I was here, and it's very good to be back, though I also return recognizing the major challenges that your country faces. Freedom House has been very dedicated to providing support to Ukraine in areas of anti-corruption as well as press freedom. And we do programming here, working with journalists, working with civil society, that we think is very important to the future of your country. We also have taken a very strong position in support of Ukraine by calling for tougher sanctions against the Putin regime, and also for providing the necessary means for Ukraine to defend itself. And that's a position that Freedom House has adopted since really the beginning of this crisis. The issues of corruption, we think, are at the heart of the challenges that Ukraine faces. In 2011 and in 2012, Freedom House issued special reports on the situation in Ukraine. They were titled "Sounding the Alarm." We identified corruption as the major threat to Ukraine. Through corruption, Ukraine becomes vulnerable to outside forces, to criminal forces, and weakens its ability to move forward in a more Western and democratic direction. And we saw in the previous government the issue of corruption become so bad that it was one of the key factors in the turnout in Maidan, people calling for an end of corrupt leadership and for rule of law. Energy sector has been the main area in which corruption has thrived. And it's critical for Ukraine to deal with problems of corruption in the energy sector. But corruption is a problem beyond the energy sector, in other sectors of the Ukrainian economy and in Ukrainian government. In meetings so far today, we have stressed the importance of dealing with the problem of corruption, of passing necessary legislation that provides a transparent and legal framework for dealing with corrupt activities, for people who have engaged in corrupt actions, and for accountability and justice. We also have stressed the importance of a free press. And in the cases, I believe we have heard that over 300 journalists' cases have been filed, and yet only 4 cases have been brought to court so far. There needs to be more progress made in this area so that journalists are able to do their job without concern for their safety and their well-being. Journalism is a key part of any democracy, and in Ukraine that is no different, where journalists need to play a role, and journalists, in fact, can play a very important role in exposing cases of corruption, abuses by government, and other problems that exist. So we think these two issues go hand in hand. They are very closely tied to each other. And we will continue to push with our work and activities here in the country, as well as from our headquarters in Washington, the importance of moving Ukraine in a more democratic, rule of law, European direction. And that's something that we will continue to strongly support. I should also add that we believe very firmly in the importance of the upcoming parliamentary elections and hope that these elections, as the May presidential election was, will be conducted in a free and fair fashion and will meet the standards of the international community. There is a lot at stake in these elections on October 26th, and it's important that they be credible, that they be conducted in a democratic fashion, and that they allow as many Ukrainians as possible, under the circumstances in the East, to participate in this process, so that the elections represent all Ukrainians throughout the country, including hopefully even people living in Crimea, to participate in this process. Mentioning Crimea, I also want to say that people in this country, of course, will never recognize the annexation, but it's very important that leaders and people in the West stress that same message. Crimea is often not mentioned by Western leaders or by analysis that's done in the West, but we have to continue to stress the non-recognition of the annexation of Crimea and stress the importance that Crimea be returned one day under Ukrainian control. So I think with that, let me stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kramer. Do you have any questions? How do you assess the current accomplishments of the Ukrainian government in terms of corruption fighting?
I think,
if we can speak of any success
sure.
so far.
I think there has not been enough progress made in this area, and I think government officials would be the first ones to say that. I think we need to see more legislation passed by the Parliament that provides the necessary legal framework for dealing with the problem of corruption. We need to see more investigations and specific cases brought in a credible fashion, not in an arbitrary fashion, but in a credible legal fashion against individuals who have engaged in corruption. And then we also need to see much greater progress in the energy sector and other key parts of the economy that have been so badly affected by corruption. So this is also an area where I think the international community can provide some support in investigations and providing some expertise on the necessary legal framework, in providing information and evidence that would stand up in a court of law to pursue prosecutions against those that the government believes are guilty. And so these cases, I think, are very important. It is, I think, important to remember, of course, that we are near the end of September. The government has really been in place technically since the end of February, but after the presidential election and things, it's been a very brief period of time. But my impression from this very brief visit to Ukraine is Ukrainians want to see results. They want to see tangible change. And frankly, they have a right to demand that from their government. And so I hope the government delivers on that.
Do you believe that the lack of these results is the main reason? The main reason is lack of legislation or the poor enforcement?
I think it's a combination of lack of legislation, lack of serious investigations, the difficulty of putting the right people in positions in government and in the investigator's office, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Justice, the SBU, we have to remember that in many of these agencies, there was a very unhealthy infiltration by Russian forces. And so one of the first steps is to remove that penetration by Russian forces into these agencies so that Ukrainians who respect rule of law are in these positions and are able to do their job. So that takes time. It can't be done overnight with the snap of a finger. It takes time, but people want to see results.
Just the last question from me on this subject. Do you believe that the anti-corruption bureau that is now being developed in Ukraine can help to serve this purpose, to beat the corruption?
I think an anti-corruption bureau is very important and necessary for Ukraine. It has to be credible. It can't be driven by a political agenda. It has to be rooted in a legal framework that is credible and that people believe in, so that we don't see the legal system and the courts and the prosecutor's office used to engage in political vengeance. It needs to be done in a rule of law, credible basis, but I think an anti-corruption bureau is very needed and very important.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of more questions from here.
Hello, David. First, thanks for your help in fighting corruption for Ukrainian journalists and just all what your organization does for us and for all Eastern European region. I'm Nikolai Vorobyov, Ukrainian investigative journalist, and have a couple of questions. So the first is, what do you expect from the upcoming new report of your organization on Ukraine? Because we slightly improved our position since the Yanukovych resignation. So what do you expect? Will we move maybe further in the list? Because now we are partly free. And the second question is a former assistant secretary. Can you please just evaluate the latest visit of Poroshenko president to the United States and his speech in Congress? Well, and could we actually expect the military support from the United States? Maybe you can tell us something more. Thanks.
Mikhail, thanks for the question. On what we can expect in our reports, it's a little early for me to forecast where Ukraine will come out. Keep in mind, at this time a year ago, people were not expecting the protests in November. So I'm a little reluctant to say what we will judge 2014 to be like in Ukraine. The push for a democratic, accountable government is a very positive development. In general, I think what we saw represented in Maidan last November until February was a real tribute to Ukraine and the people here who want to live in a more democratic society with no corruption, with more transparency, more European identification, and I think that's a very positive thing. At the same time, part of your country has been occupied and invaded. And so our reports are not a scorecard of a government. They reflect the political rights and civil liberties in the country as a whole. And so Ukraine will be a difficult case for us to assess, because many people in the East, particularly in Crimea, but not just Crimea, have suffered terribly, and their political rights and civil liberties have been badly infringed. In the case of journalists, with our press freedom report, similar problems, which is, I think there is a diversity of media. There are problems with ownership of media, and there have also been problems with attacks against journalists, where journalists have become the deliberate targets of certain people, and that needs to end. There need to be credible investigations brought against those who engage in violence against journalists. I mentioned the statistic we've heard of about 300 cases, but only 4 being brought to the courts. There needs to be much more progress in that area. On President Poroshenko's visit to Washington, I left Washington for Estonia Wednesday, so I missed his visit. But from what I've read and heard, and I read his speech, and I saw the reaction in the U.S. Congress, I think that was very positive. And there was a clear demonstration from the U.S. Congress of bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats, agreeing on showing solidarity with Ukraine. On the issue of military assistance, from what I've heard, the U.S. is providing some radar systems that can be useful in helping pinpoint certain artillery systems and others on Ukrainian territory. That's important. I think intelligence sharing has picked up. But there's no question that President Obama has continued to stand by his position of not providing lethal assistance. My view is that's a mistake on the part of the United States. I think we should provide the means by which Ukraine can defend itself. And so I hope that the support in the Congress for lethal assistance will lead to the ability to persuade the White House to change its mind. But it was clear, I think, in President Obama's comments that that position is still the one in place. Did you want
to? And one more remark, please.
Yeah.
Well, so on the one hand, we see that government, Congress, they support Ukrainian army, well, in Ukraine fighting against Russia. So, and the next question is, have you heard something about this act, freedom for support Ukraine freedom act?
Yeah, Menendez-Corker.
Right, and it was accepted either in the House and in Senate. What does it mean? But they mentioned that they would provide the weapon next year. And as far as I know, Obama has signed this law. So what does it mean for us?
If he signed it, then that is a new development I haven't heard. I think the law still needs to go through the Congress. It hasn't completed that process. And part of the problem, this is a political issue in the United States. We have our elections for the House of Representatives and for 1/3 of the Senate in November. And so the Congress is going into recess, which means it won't be meeting until after those elections. So if the legislation is not completed, it can be revisited in November or December when, after our elections, the Congress returns to Washington. But with or without the legislation formally passed, I don't think there's any question that there is strong bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress to stand with Ukraine, provide the economic assistance, and to impose further sanctions against the Putin regime, including, by the way, the legislation calls for sanctions against Gazprom, which I strongly support. After all, Gazprom is the company that cut off energy to Ukraine. And there haven't been any sanctions either by the Europeans or by the United States against Gazprom. But the legislation also calls for military assistance, $350 million, in fact, I believe, in military assistance. And I think it is, if the legislation is passed, I think it is unlikely President Obama would veto the legislation. I think he would sign it, in which case the U.S. would move forward. My concern, my problem is that I think this assistance should have been provided months ago. It's late. It's not too late, but it's late in the process. And the military assistance is as important psychologically as it is militarily, as a demonstration of U.S. and NATO support for Ukraine that does not involve soldiers on the ground, but helps you and your country defend your territory.
Hello, my name is Irina Fadets, and I've been a visiting fellow in the Heritage Foundation in spring this year, and I've been writing a report on corruption in Ukraine, and I would like to go back to the question of corruption. When I was writing this report, I noticed that in Ukraine, we actually have probably some information on the scope of corruption. I mean, there are, NGOs, some watchdog organizations that actually follow the public tenders, and they know how much money is being distributed between all those firms. Some of these are very new and shady and not very reliable. And I was just wanted to ask a question. So we have this information, but it seems to me that Ukrainian other organizations, people, NGOs, they seem to lack this action, lack the ability to act on this information. So there seems to be some kind of gap between what we know and what we actually do. And maybe you could comment on this. How do you see the role of Ukrainian civil society in this process? Thank you.
In our meetings so far on this brief visit, we have stressed the importance of government-civil society partnership. This has to be done together. And civil society cannot be viewed as a threat or as an enemy, but as a partner in these efforts. And from what I heard in some of the meetings this morning, there is government recognition that that needs to happen, and to create opportunities and venues for civil society to bring information to the attention of authorities and to conduct the investigations in an open, transparent manner. The transparency here is critical, and civil society has to, I think, continue to insist on an open, transparent process so that decisions are not made in an arbitrary fashion. But we are not meeting with the Prosecutor General's office on this visit. I met with them when I was here in 2012. That was an example of how not to do things. And so we need to show examples of positive things, of the way to do things. And civil society very much needs to play a role in this. There's no question.
There is one more question.
My name is Lisa, Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and I have a question. For me, freedom actually means also to have a right to travel without borders and to return to your homeland or to your house. But unfortunately, a lot of Ukrainians and a lot of Crimean Tatars, they don't have an opportunity to return to Crimea because just that authorities, they closed that border for them. What would you suggest for that people, maybe to go to a court or some to European institutions to get that right back to return to their home? And also another question, quite specific, about also traveling. How would you describe Ukrainian struggle, and how we are far from joining the visa liberalization with the EU? Like how do you see how much time we need more to have an opportunity to travel without any visa? Thank you.
On the second question, it's hard for an American to talk about EU visa liberalization. It would be easy for me to stand here and say it should happen today or yesterday. But I do hope that there will be a move to ease the visa process with EU countries. Let me also acknowledge that visas for the U.S. are also difficult. So we're not, from an American perspective, we're not in a very strong position to criticize the EU on these issues. But I do hope it happens quickly, because I do believe that more interaction and travel between EU countries and Ukraine benefits Ukrainians, and it benefits the rest of the Europeans as well. On the issue of travel for Crimea, the first challenge, I think, is to make sure people are aware, in part because Crimea often is forgotten in the discussion about the challenges Ukraine faces. The denial of entry for Crimean Tatar leaders in particular is outrageous, absolutely outrageous. and contrary to the false promises that Putin made to Crimean Tatars. The Russian leadership has proven to be total liars on many issues, including Crimea and the ability to enter Crimea and to allow free entry and exit. And the Crimean Tatars, as you know, have been through enough challenges and problems over the decades to now once again be under the thumb of Russia is not what they wanted. There was no interest among the Crimean Tatar population to be annexed by Russia. I don't even think there was much interest among Russians living in Crimea to be under Russian thumb. So more attention to this, more demands from the West to allow entry into Crimea for Crimean Tatars or anyone else who is trying to return home. As you rightly pointed out, the ability to travel freely is a fundamental right. And that was denied to many people in the Soviet system. And what we're seeing in Crimea under Russian control is looking like the worst of the Soviet system.
We have a few more questions, one from Voice of America.
Ruslan Denichenko, VOA. Mr. Kramer, I know that some former Ukrainian government officials who were probably involved in corruption schemes would like to return to Ukraine and probably pay some fines and cooperate with investigation. Do you think it's a good idea to allow them to do that? What do you think about that situation? Should Ukrainian government allow them to return?
I think each case needs to be decided on its individual merits. And the issue of lustration, for example, needs to be considered very carefully to make sure it's not done arbitrarily or in such a sweeping manner that it winds up producing enemies instead of trying to win over cooperation. I think a very careful look needs to be given to people who engaged in corruption for years in this country, made this country weaker and more vulnerable than it should be, and that they should be investigated if they engaged in the illegal activity, and let the legal process determine what kind of penalty and consequences they should face. It would not be a good idea, I think, to simply allow people to pay a fine in order to return to the country and then re-engage in politics as usual. I don't think that's what the people outside of this building were protesting back in November through February and beyond. I think people here want an end to corruption, and they need an end to corruption. Corruption exists everywhere. It's a matter of degree. And I think the degree in this country for too long has been that it was to the extreme. And so it's important to make sure that people who engage in corruption understand there are consequences for that kind of action.
Mr. Kramer, hi. I'm Owen Matthews from Newsweek magazine. I have a quick question about your strong support for what you delicately term lethal assistance. I mean, as you're surely aware, it can be argued that it's actually the worst of both worlds for Ukraine. It's not enough assistance to make a serious difference, but it's exactly what the Kremlin is looking for as an excuse to continue and widen and consolidate its conquests in the southeast of Ukraine. What do you say to that, that actually you're handing them a poisoned chalice?
Well, I would look at the reality we're facing right now, which is we have not provided lethal assistance. Crimea has been taken over. Eastern Ukraine has been destabilized. And so not providing lethal assistance has not created a better situation. I do think, and I understand that argument, I do think that if NATO and the West and the United States showed more solidarity militarily with Ukraine, that Putin would be more likely to back down, not respond in kind. It's a bit of a gamble, I realize, but I think Putin exploits weakness and opportunity and backs down when faced with a similar challenge, as he did in Georgia, when we brought back Georgian troops who were fighting overseas, when we sent ships into the Black Sea. Part of the problem, I think, from the Western side is we have been far too clear in telling Putin what we won't do. I would rather leave Putin guessing what we might do rather than continually tell him we will not provide lethal assistance. The Washington Post editorial page had a great phrase for this. They said it was gratuitous clarity, unnecessary clarity. I think we have been far too explicit in explaining our limitations instead of leaving options open, as Secretary Kerry did, by the way, at the very beginning of the crisis on Sunday talk shows at the very beginning of March. I think his approach was right, rather than for us to keep taking options off the table and making it clear to Putin that he has a green light to do what he wants and that we won't respond beyond sanctions. I don't want to minimize the importance of sanctions. I think the sanctions are having a real impact on the Russian economy, but not sufficient to change Putin's decision-making and behavior. And so I think the sanctions have been too reactive and not fast enough, but overall quite impressive. But they need to be accompanied by the military support for Ukraine so that it can defend itself. Ukrainians, after all, have been asking for this for months. We don't have NATO obligations with Ukraine, but we do have Budapest Memorandum obligations with Ukraine. And Russia was also one of those signatories, as you know, in 1994, but so was the United States and the UK. And I don't think we've done enough to live up to our end of the bargain on that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kramer, for your great and very straightforward and clear insights on so many aspects and topics. Thank you so much. Again, happy to meet you here in Ukraine Crisis Media Center once you have any opportunities to come. Дякую, колеги. На сьогодні робочий день закінчений. And have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Back to you, US. Thanks.